I'm going to step out for a quick second. I'm going to ask Vice Chair Brittany Cummins to take number 17. It's informational. Thank you, Brittany.
Yeah.
I'll be back.
Thanks. Okay, item 17, School Turnaround and Leadership Development Act Overview. We have Max Lang and Leslie Evans Jones. There was the one item on consent, and then this was just information. Welcome, and thank you for being here today. If you want to go ahead with your presentation.
Thank you. I'm going to take the opportunity to introduce myself and then allow my colleague to introduce herself. My name is Max Lang. I am one of your specialists here at USBE. I work with school turnaround. Specifically, I work in the ESCA programs and related state initiatives section.
And I'm Leslie Evans, Max's colleague in turnaround and improvement as well.
Thank you for this opportunity to talk about School Turnaround and Leadership Development Act. This is a good opportunity for us to acknowledge the hard work that these schools and communities have done, these LEAs have done, your staff here at USBE have done, and that you have done. And it also allows us the opportunity to acknowledge the accomplishments that many of these schools are making. Next slide. Hopefully this got around to you. I passed around a sheet with this particular slide, and you can use this as a reference as I go through this. I'll use this slide right now to kind of set a context for what we're talking about. In 2015, the legislature passed the School Turnaround and Leadership Development Act, and under that act enacted our certain provisions for how schools would be identified under the act, certain things that were required to be implemented in the schools at the LEA and here at the USBE under the act, and then exit criteria and some other details under that act. In 2017, the act was amended, and it made some critical changes to those exact same things. How schools were identified, things that needed to be implemented at the schools, at the LEA, and here at the USBE. There were some changes, and then the exit criteria for those schools moving forward. The difference between those two bills, at least in some of the circles that I run, the first version of the bill in 2015 was also known as SB 235. The amendment to the bill in the circles that I've been running is known as SB 234. So our plan today to provide this information to you is to follow that exact plan. I'm going to talk about Cohort 1 under SB 235 as the schools known identified under SB 235 in the first version of this bill, how the schools were identified, what things were implemented in the schools, LEA and USBE, the exit criteria, and then one thing that I want to make sure that both Leslie and I do is highlight anything that is forthcoming that will require a decision or an action from the board members here. Okay. And then I'll turn the time over to Leslie to talk about the same things in that same format moving forward with Cohort 2. All right.
Go ahead and push the button on your microphone.
Okay. Cohort 1. So in 2015, pursuant to the bill, schools were identified because they were the lowest 3% of schools based on their points and percentage of those points in the state accountability system. That identification was based on 1 year of data, only the 2014-2015 data. 26 schools were identified. The USBE participated in an RFP process to identify and approve a list of turnaround expert providers. We contracted with those providers. The schools were required to select one of those from the USBE-approved list. Once a turnaround expert provider was selected, that turnaround expert provider received the first half of the payment of their contract. Those turnaround expert providers and school turnaround committees worked together to develop plans based on needs assessments that were conducted in those schools. Those plans that were developed pursuant to the results of the needs assessment, in partnership with the turnaround expert providers, school turnaround committees implemented strategies in those schools based on the needs assessment, as I said. The turnaround expert providers provided coaching to school leadership and some teacher leaders in the schools. School faculties received professional development that was focused on the areas that were identified in the needs assessment and the strategies that correlated with those. USBE did an RFP to fulfill, in accordance with the statute, a leadership development activity for those school leaders that were in schools that were identified for school turnaround. We contracted with Utah Education Policy Center in collaboration with the Center for School Turnaround at WestEd and USBE staff, and developed is called LIFT. And this is, those administrators were invited to participate. LIFT stands for Leadership and Inquiry for Turnaround. The exit criteria for this. So schools that were identified in 2015 for turnaround. Under the bill, they were required to improve performance by at least one letter grade. So whatever grade they got in 24-15, in 2017-2018, they had to have improved by at least one letter grade. In response to a lot of requests that we got from schools, LEAs, turnaround expert providers, we knew that that scores would be delayed because of the science piece of that until later in the year. They were implored us to find a way to identify the exit criteria for those schools in cohort 1 immediately. So in order to do that, what we did was we used science scores where we had them, and then you can see kind of up there, because of the delay, we used English language arts and math scores to determine where those schools fell in regards to their scores based on 2014-2015 data, and then again in 2017-2018. All right. So this, and what's good about this particular chart here that you see on this slide is, of the 26 schools that were identified in 2014 as being in the lowest 3% performing on the state accountability system, 19 of those 26 schools exited, meaning they improved their performance by at least one letter grade. A number of those schools improved at least 2 letter grades. Mont Harmon Middle School improved 3 letter grades. This middle slide talks about one caveat. If some of these schools identified in 2014-2015 at the 2017 exit criteria determination had demonstrated that they had showed progress towards their academic goals in that school, they qualified for an extension. And I'm going to talk about this. There's a further slide that has a lot more detail about this. But 3 of those schools qualified for an extension. 3 schools did not exit, meaning they did not improve, and that their letter grade was at the same level upon their identification as it was an exit criteria. One of those schools closed. It was one of our charter schools. Okay, a little bit more detail about. This is a slide. I know that some folks really learn well by infographics, by graphic organizers like this. So we put this in here because there's a lot of moving parts in regards to cohort 1, how they were identified, the things that had to be implemented in those schools, and the exit criteria. So we put this in here as a reference if it helps for you to follow through on that flow chart. Okay, some details. Cohort 1 schools, 19 of those schools met the exit criteria. The turnaround expert providers that worked with those 19 schools will receive the second half of the payment on their contracts. Those schools, dependent in a prorated fashion, will receive recognition and reward funds depending on how many letter grades they improved. This is a busy slide, and this goes back to that middle column of the extension. There were 3 schools that qualified for an extension. And overall, what that means is they demonstrated progress towards their academic goals. They didn't demonstrate enough progress to meet the criteria to exit, but they demonstrated enough that we responded in saying they qualify to pursue the turnaround efforts they are, because it looks as though pursuing those efforts will lead them to exit that criteria. I won't read all of those particular things. One of the requirements that schools who qualified for an extension must do, and it's listed in the rule defined as in-depth analysis, to take a look at the curriculum and its alignment to the school's academic goals. Schools will continue under an extension with their contracted turnaround expert providers, and those providers, if after 1 year the school exits turnaround status, they'll receive the second half of their payment. If they don't exit after 1 year, they can continue an additional year for up to 2 years. The same stands true for recognition and reward funds for those schools. If they exit after 1 year, the schools will receive their recognition and reward funds, depending on how many grades they improved. After 2 years, and if they don't exit after 1 year, then that holds true for the second year. Okay.
Can we pause at cohort 1?
Well, we're not done. All right. So this
Can you
third
pause
piece.
just one moment? Second for a
Absolutely.
question? Okay, Board
Yes.
Member Beebe?
Thank you. So I'm looking at the slide that talks about the school that's exited, the schools that qualified, and the schools not exiting. So if we are going to qualify the 3% that need this program, and then we have a school that closed, one school that could have been into this program was now not part of this program. And then if we encumbered money towards this school that closed, where does that encumbered money go? And is the company that was working with them get paid, or do they not get paid? So I think that this plan was made for a very traditional model that was, stable, but we have this instability with our charter schools, and what have we done to, not always, but with this one in particular, what are we doing to insulate ourselves from the money that was invested or the time that was invested in this charter school that ended up closing before it was exited? Or
That particular school board member, we went back and did the calculations for that school to see where they would have fallen in regards to meeting the exit criteria, and they would not have met the exit criteria. The turnaround expert provider working with that school would not have received that payment, but that school would have, and we'll talk about this next piece of it, would have been held accountable to the pieces, the actions moving forward for not. So it's a really good question. I don't have a definite answer for it. I would have to defer to further conversations with team members.
have a follow-up?
Do you have a follow-up?
So my concern is that the time and energy that was put into helping these students, because it's really not the school, but it's the population. Now the work that was done with this population is now radiated across a whole bunch of people. And so when we determined that that population had a need, now are they getting the same supports where they went to? So I struggle with another school that was a little bit more stable might have been able to get these services and had an impact in their communities. And it was, all those plans, and it just evaporated.
I can't comment to
Okay.
where those students went or what happened after, but
Thank you.
it's a really good point. It's a really good question. This last piece for cohort 1 schools, the schools that did not exit, 3 schools did not exit. So what happens now for those schools that did not exit pursuant to the rule? These schools are going to be, there will be a USBE, so your board ultimate decision and action. The requirement calls for 2 groups to provide these recommendations to you. The one group is a state review panel that's made up of expertise pursuant to school turnaround and that have vested interests in those things. And the second group is for a district school. It would be the local school board. For a charter school, it will be the charter school authorizer that will make recommendations to you, and then your recommendations will be the actions that will be the school will have to take. And then these next two slides will distinguish specifically as outlined or delineated in the rule what those possible recommendations could be for district schools and charter schools. So the next slide talks about district schools. Personnel changes, these are in the rule listed as possible recommendations or actions that the school would take upon your decision. Personnel changes, involuntary transfers, that the school board change the school boundaries, appoint a public or nonprofit entity other than the local school board to manage and operate the school, permanently transfer control of the school to a public or nonprofit entity other than the local school board, or this last one, which is in both of these sections, take other action. This next slide is for charter schools specifically. Personnel changes, the charter school governing board be replaced, the school authorizer close the school, replace some or all the members of the charter school governing board, transfer operation and control of the charter school to a high-performing charter school or to the district where the school is located, and then this one again, take other actions. I'll just point out that this piece, take other actions, is not defined in the rule or the act.
Okay, we have one question, Board Member Reby.
So when we go into this agreement for a turnaround school and a charter school says that they want to receive these funds, can we get is there a way for us to create a agreement that they're going to work for 3 years with this program? I mean, to end this program before it was actually went to its natural ending seems like it was a waste of time and money. So is there a way that we can put language in here so that if we are going to do this to the charter school board has an obligation to shut a school, they might consider not shutting a school because they're getting these turnaround fundings? Is that something that we can put in the language for this?
I would have to defer that to legal. There's a piece in there's a piece in the actual bill that delineates that the charter school authorizer, upon identification for school turnaround, can go through a process of determining whether the school should be shut down.
Mm-hmm.
There isn't language that I know of, and I could be wrong, and I'd be happy to be corrected, that says that there would be an obligation for the school to stay in there and not be shut down at any point during that 3 years, or that we have an obligation to make sure that we're working with that school for 3 years. Well, we have the obligation, Leslie and I do for sure, but that if the school were shut down, that there's any kind of language. Now, whether it could be added, I don't know.
I mean, we're investing in it as a state, and I think that they should be encouraged or found some kind of way to stay open so that they can reap the benefit of that investment.
Board Member Hanson?
Just a question on the process. So the authorizer looks at it, and then the review board looks at it, and they both make recommendations, right? And so when it comes to the board, do we decide we're going to follow the recommendation, or can we decide to do any of these other things? Or
Yes.
is it one of those things that we just go ahead and kind of rubber stamp what was happening before?
It's the final recommendation is made by you, so it could be either of those things, a combination of those things. So it could be, yes, we're going to follow the recommendations of the local school board and the state review team, the charter school authorizer and the state review team, or you're the board, you could decide
To do
one of
something
these
else.
things or something else.
Okay.
Board Member Belknap?
Kathleen, I'm going to pretend like you can do this easy, okay? These 26 schools are all in the first cohort. They have been in for 3 years. The two of them, 3 schools are in extension. They've requested an extension, and the other 4 did not, and 1 closed, but it closed for many more reasons than just academics, okay? And now there's already another cohort that's already started. So any funding that isn't used up will go to the next cohorts that come. That money is funneled to turnaround. Okay, I just didn't know when you asked that question.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to turn the time over to Leslie, who's going to talk about the Cohort 2 and Cohort 3 schools. Keeping in mind, if you use that reference, Cohort 2 schools are those schools that fall under identification and the implementation and the exit criteria as defined in the amendments to 235. So there are some critical changes to those pieces which she'll talk about under 234 under the amendments.
Okay, so cohort 2, am I on there? Cohort 2 was identified in 2017. They'll be looking at exit determination in 2020. I believe if you remember on the consent calendar, the cohort 2 plans just were approved. Okay. The identification is similar for cohort 2 in that the lowest 3% of schools based on the accountability data, but this time with 2 consecutive years of data. Cohort 1 was identified with 1 year of data. Cohort 2 will be identified with 2, or was. The 5 schools that were identified in 17 are listed there. And the schools participated in that comprehensive needs assessment and root cause analysis, but this time in cohort 2, it was conducted by a third party who was, we reached a professional service agreement, I believe it was, with that third party agency. The schools then contracted themselves, instead of the USBE holding that contract, the schools contracted with a turnaround expert from a USBE approved list, and the turnaround plans are then approved by this body as well. Implementation was similar in that professional development was offered. The LIFT program from the Utah Education Policy Center was offered, and a third-party evaluator monitored the turnaround plan implementation. To exit for cohort 2 school, a school must demonstrate that the school no longer falls into that bottom 3% on the accountability results. So for the second and third years consecutively after which the school is identified, so in the case of cohort 2, we're in that year right now. This would be that second year for them. So they'll need to have consecutive progress or not fall into that bottom 3%.
Okay, can we pause for just a couple
Sure.
questions? Board Member Ellis, Vice Chair Ellis.
Thank you. I apologize. I was trying to hold my questions till the end, but given that we're having other questions answered, I didn't want to come to you with like 100 questions going back a million slides. So one of the questions I have is turnaround experts. I get that we are approving the plans, but can you explain to me how the turnaround experts are identified?
I will talk about cohort 1, how they were identified. So that was an actual RFP process. So proposals were sent in, and then criteria was met based on essentially their expertise and experience in working with turnaround schools and looking at data-driven strategies or methods of determining those needs. So that was an RFP which was vetted, and then we actually at the USBE contracted with those particular turnaround expert providers.
Okay. Thank you.
Cohort 2 is slightly different.
Okay. My question is when those schools are coming out of turnaround or whatever, I've heard just kind of off the cuff comments that maybe there were some concerns aside from, some of the things that I thought of, but I'm just trying to look through the lens of there's more traditional routes to education, and then often our charter schools are trying to do something just a little bit different and approach a little bit different, but also public schools are as well sometimes, depending on where you are. But if someone is going in as an expert and they have this one linear vision of what success should look like, I'm concerned if they're, so I just want to know how they're identifying themselves as experts and if they're seeing something as a red flag just because it doesn't fit the norm.
Yeah, there's some, are you going to go ahead and talk about it?
Are there
There are some real
specific-
specific changes for cohort 2 schools and cohort 3 moving forward.
Okay.
The process for which turnaround expert providers are identified for cohort 2 and moving forward is USBE conducts a request for statements of qualification. So what we're just saying is, give us your track record, your experience, and your willingness to work with any school in the state. Those go before a review committee. They're rated, and then some are selected. Those are on the approved USBE list. Under cohort 2 and moving forward, then the LEAs actually conduct the RFP. They send a RFP out to each of those turnaround expert providers on the approved USBE list, and then they conduct the contract. For cohort 2 and moving forward, those contracts that are held with the LEA, there's a lot more authority given to the LEA to determine elements such as performance-based or the opportunity to cut that contract off or end that contract if it's determined that that turnaround expert provider is not fulfilling the obligations that they contracted for. Does that answer the full question?
Okay, we're gonna have Superintendent Dixon.
Yeah, I think Dr. Lang addressed that really well, but I just want to loop back and remind the board that you all supported that statutory change, and it was for that very reason that Vice Chair Ellis mentioned, that it was very driven by the person who would be providing the intervention, and we felt like that would really impact the protocol that they were using so that they could just insert their services without really doing a better scan of the needs of the school. So that was a really positive change that I think you all asked for in the statute that led then to better analysis, an outside analysis.
And if, can I?
Yes.
And it occurs to me there's another piece of it that's I think impacts this specifically. Another change in the bill for cohort 2 and moving forward is that a third party comes in that's different from that turnaround expert provider working in the school and conducts a comprehensive needs assessment and root cause analysis. So when the turnaround expert provider goes in to partner with the turnaround committee at the school to develop the plans must address the root causes of low performance as identified in that previous needs assessment. So what it does is it really focuses on the root causes. It really impacts the way those plans are developed so that the plans are specific to the school's context, the staff, and also identifies the professional development and coaching that would be needed to move those things forward dependent upon that needs assessment and root cause.
Okay. Board Member Reeby, do you have a quick question on this? We need to move a little bit more quickly on this presentation, so do you have a quick question on it? Okay.
So if in this slide before, these schools are all choice schools, and parents have a choice to send their kids, and their choice is not to follow a traditional model. Do these schools have a choice not to be a part of this turnaround program? Because if they're teaching an alternative core and they have highlighted something different, what would be the benefit of us coming in and saying, this is what we need you to teach? And like, well, that's not our mission. So if that's not their mission and we tell them to, I don't understand if this is the choice that these parents are making to send their kids to the school because they want an alternative choice, what's the benefit of coming in with, I don't understand that, because if it's not their mission, it's not going to continue on. So
Okay, if you want to finish up your slide, that'd be great, thank you.
Three will be identified as soon as that accountability results come out for this year. Going forward, will be exited in 2021. And to keep it simple, this is the only slide on cohort 3. They'll be identified soon, and we'll follow all the cohort 2 processes.
Okay, Vice Chair Ellis?
Thank you. So on cohort 3, which we don't know who they are yet, but I want to kind of mix and mingle a little bit cohort 2 and cohort 3, because in cohort 2, there were schools identified that had a very high opt-out rate. And as I understand it, statute gives us the provision to look at other indicators and not just our state assessment for turnaround status. And it's my understanding that our rule is more stringent than the statute, less flexible. And so when we're looking at, I have a concern about funneling money to schools that may not really need it. And so I just want to address this as a board so that we can make changes if necessary, so that if a school is identified and they have, statistically, so right now, we voted that the end size would be 10. So only 10 students would have to test, but that, in my opinion, is not statistically sound to show growth. And, so we could be falsely identifying schools for turnaround. And I have real concerns with reports I'm hearing from Dixie Montessori, and that the turnaround experts went in and a lot of changes are being made to the school, but the parents are choosing that school because it was something different. And now it's becoming more streamlined and more standardized and more the same as everything else. And so the reports I'm hearing back from the people that were choosing that is they're not happy with the changes. And so maybe now it's going to look more in line or in sync with what is what the provisions are that we're requiring, but that whole population of people that were looking for something different don't have, an option just was removed from underneath them. And so this is a lot of different topics kind of all mixed into one, but I'd like to look at what the board can do to, when cohort 3 is identified, so that we can possibly make some changes to rule if necessary. But we don't know yet if it's going to be the same problem that was in cohort 2, where you had schools identified that had a very high opt-out rate. We don't know yet. But if that is the case, that we can move forward, just making an allowance to look at other indicators to show success. And I just wanted to know if you could explain the difference between statute and what our current rule is on the requirements for identifying a school for turnaround?
Yeah. Do you guys have a quick answer to that, or is this something we can follow up on?
I think I personally would feel better if we had a chance to follow up on it, to look at all of the
Okay, thank you.
details.
That's fine.
I think the basic answer is statute just identifies 3% on 2 consecutive years of data. You're right. The rule does have a couple of more elements to it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So that could be something that you could maybe email to the full board as an answer to that question. That would be good. Okay, Chair Huntsman?
And maybe with the interest of time, and we have this presentation, if we have other questions, let's funnel them to Lorraine on this, or I'd say probably to Lorraine, and flesh out more of the concerns that we have, and we'll bring that forward in another meeting. I mean, this is all good stuff, but there's a lot of really good questions and concerns raised, so let's not
Okay.
put it to bed.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much for your time and your report to us. Thanks.
I guess Brittany wants me to take my seat back.